Okay, great. Perfect. So thank you everyone for those who joined on time. Okay. So we all know that cloud computing or cloud services bring in the opportunity to speed up our businesses. They give us scalability, agility, and improved collaboration, definitely. But something, as we all agree, we cannot forget is about the information or data security. Now, in the previous session, our friend Sapna, she kindly shared her knowledge and experience around the security controls that we can implement in a cloud environment. So following that, I thought that maybe I could volunteer to share some of the best practices around the cloud security governance. So basically what we could, should, and must do when either heading towards or during our usage of cloud computing. So I have a bit brief about me, but I think looking at the audience, everyone probably knows me. But for those who have never met me, this is how I look. Okay, so in terms of today's agenda, we'll quickly look at, we'll just set the context by looking at what and where are we using cloud today, and then talk a bit about the key considerations for our journey to cloud. And something very important from my governance perspective is understanding the span of the control. Yeah. And then we'll do a slight more detailed conversation on a few governance aspects. And something that was kind of quite a point of interest in our last session was the GDPR and the cloud. So I thought maybe I'll spend some time just talking about that and what we should look at when, if we are under or if GDPR is applicable to us, which in a lot of scenarios would be. So before I start, is there anything else? So the way we'll run it is I'll quickly share my views, and if there's any questions, we'll try to take it towards the end, if that's okay. Yeah, and if you have, as you get the questions, please type it on the chat window or hold it until the end, so that if there's something that's covered in the following slides, then we just follow the flow. Okay, is that okay? Or sorry, okay, so there's nothing. How do I close this? Sorry. Okay, is that all right? Should we head on?
Yes, all right.
Okay, thank you. So sorry, I'm using two screens and I can't find my mouse now. Okay, there you go. Okay, so let's look at the what of the cloud usage. So basically, if we look at the slide on the screen, and this is something I've taken from McAfee's risk report of 2019, and I believe most of us would agree that bulk of the cloud is used for file sharing and collaboration. Yes, there is a steep increase in terms of the applications and scalability and all that stuff, but still the portion of cloud that's being used for file sharing and collaboration is quite considerable as compared to the rest of the stuff. Yeah. And even if we look at our own personal use cases or our own organizations, we'll start realizing that bulk of the cloud is used for indeed just plain file sharing and collaboration. Now, looking at the where of the cloud usage, again, this is the source is McAfee's report, is 62% of the files are shared between business partners. Now, these business partners are kind of broadly categorized into vendors or your end customers and things like that. But the most risky ones are, again, the personal email addresses and anyone with a link kind of cloud access. And where I've seen the anyone with a link option most commonly used is the Google Drive. Now, Google Drive is on an increase. So everybody in my circle, at least, they share the pictures, the documents on Google Drive. So basically, if I have a Google account and I can get hold of a Google Drive link, 8 out of the 10 times I can actually just get access to the data. Yeah. So that is something that is worrisome. And for those of us who have Google Drive or Microsoft OneDrive, we just need to be considerate that we have restricted the access and we have not kept it open for access to anyone. Yeah. Now, looking at the usage share by the cloud service provider, I think we all would agree that Amazon is kind of on one side, whereas the rest of the cloud service providers, they are all together on the other side. And this is something that has come up time and again in terms of just the surveys, in terms of all the CASB discoveries and stuff like that. So if we look at risk, then yes, AWS always comes at the top because they have most of our data, be it on a personal level or enterprise or organization level. Yeah. Okay, so moving on to the key considerations around journey to the cloud. So like with everything else, cloud services have their good, bad, and ugly. So to ensure that we don't get to experience the bad and ugly often, sometimes it might happen, but it's just to make sure it doesn't happen too often. Let's look at what we could do. So the first is we all need to have a strategic approach to using public cloud. Yeah. Now, when I say strategic approach, it basically, I'm referring to that we need to formulate an approach where through planning and policy, basically. And it is important to understand who is responsible and what's our span of control. Now, Sapna did touch upon this in her last session, but I'll also touch upon this because I don't think we can say it enough. And when I talk about the span of control, it basically means, as I said, is ownership and controlled use of all externally provisioned services. Now, something that I found very useful in practice is to form or to establish a cloud adoption subject matter expert team within your organizations. If you're already using cloud, and you'll notice that there are few people who are kind of a bit more ahead in terms of understanding the cloud from their various risk domains. So there might be some people in information security who understand the cloud a bit more or have been involved in that. There's some people in compliance who are doing that. So things like that. So when I say SME, it's not just people from IT or information security. I refer to everyone that we need. Yeah. So it can be people from compliance, your legal, your procurement side of things, and all that stuff. The next thing we need to look at is that whether we are going for infrastructure as service or platform or software as a service, we need to make sure that we have, or at least have a roadmap to develop the right level of technical and non-technical expertise around cloud usage. Yeah, and these people, this expertise would be the one who would actually be working with our business users to ensure a smoother and safer journey. Because a lot of times, especially in the enterprises, the business users are probably 50 kilometers ahead of the rest of the control functions, yeah, in terms of the cloud adoption. So we need to make sure that we have, or at least we are building the right kind of skill level in the control functions. The next thing we need to consider is the data sensitivity. Now, cloud security strategy should include guidance on what levels of data sensitivity and under what circumstances can be placed into which forms of public clouds. Yeah. So basically, so we need to establish something which will say that, well, we can put X type of data into X type of public cloud under Y situation. And if we can highlight, then we should be highlighting specifically what is not acceptable. And we should try to give some specific examples what's not acceptable, because at times we put it at such a high level that people don't really understand it. Okay, so moving on to cloud ownership and risk acceptance. Now again, I'm sure we all would know and understand from experience that forget about cloud, even our internal enterprise assets, be it an IT asset or be it a chair or a table or even water cooler, they will not be reliably used unless the responsibility has been made clear and enforced. So the foundational policy underlying the controlled use of externally provisioned services is ownership. And when I say ownership, it should include things such as responsibility for demanding compliance. So someone has to actually be owning the responsibility for the risk management, the compliance, the budget, and all those things. Yeah. And the last but not the least is managing the key control domains. Yeah, and this is something that we're going to touch upon in slightly more detail in the next slides. But when I say managing key control domains, is basically when we talk about cloud, I think one of the things about cloud is it's everywhere, or at least that's the perception. And as with the cloud comes its services, which are naturally dispersed. That's how it is, which means that we have multiple control points, multiple consoles, multiple entry points. So we can address this by dividing the control span into logical state segments and in a manageable way. Okay, moving on. So we talked about the span of control. Now, Sapna also touched upon this, and in fact something similar in her last session around the controls. So now on this one, you'll see that if you look at the legend, the blue boxes are the areas that are controlled and managed wholly by the service provider. So these are people like Amazon, Google, and Microsoft and likes. Yeah. The thing and the boxes under the green, these are wholly managed by the end users or the enterprises or the organizations. And if we look at the different hosting options, we'll clearly see that yes, the responsibility and ownership varies by the hosting mechanism or the solution type. Now, what gets tricky is, I don't know what this color is, peach or orange, whatever that is, but that is where the tricky area is, because it is shared responsibility. And the moment something becomes a shared responsibility or a shared resource, no one wants to take a responsibility, or unless very, very tightly and well defined. Yeah. So this is something that when we should look at when we choose what kind of cloud usage models we are going to opt for. Yeah. And this is where we need to give special attention on. Yeah. Now, having looked at the Middle East and Africa region, yeah, yes, a lot of the time the software as a service is now being pushed by a lot of vendors, and these vendors vary by different solution provisioning. Some are business solutions, some are security solutions, some are IT operations solutions, and things like that. So that's where the software as a solution as a service is kind of being pushed by the product vendors. Yeah. But if we look at the organizations themselves, the infrastructure as a service and platform as a service is what I've seen being opted for the most. Yeah. Now, although the responsibility for the data in the infrastructure and platform as a service lies with the enterprise, that's something that becomes business doesn't want to take responsibility, and IT is not taking responsibility because business is way ahead than IT in terms of cloud adoption. So I think that's the journey that not only this region, I think most of the organizations adopting cloud is taking, because as long as the infrastructure and platforms were all hosted internally and managed by IT, a lot of business users were getting off the hook by saying, well, it's IT manages the system, it's IT's business, IT's problem. But now that it's no longer hosted and managed by IT, they're starting to feel the pain that, oh, well, there's something more for me to look at. Anyways, so I talked about managing the span. So the previous slide talked about where the responsibilities lie. Who is responsible? Now that's fair. So we can say that yes, I'm responsible. Now the question is, how do I practically manage things? Yeah, to make sure that my cloud service is secure. What do I need to do practically? We can say so many things, but what does it mean? Now, we all agree that cloud services and it controls, again, it's all scattered. Yeah. And if we look at the top sort of security breaches over the years, we'll realize that most of them have happened actually due to either negligence or misconfigurations. Now, negligence is something we could take care by improved awareness and stuff. But when it comes to misconfiguration, this, in my view, has got a lot to do with the expertise and the partners that organizations use to deploy cloud services. Now, if we'll just look at some of the examples, it's mostly to do with the data storage encryption has not been turned on, so people could get access to that. Then there was unrestricted outbound and inbound access. Yes, the cloud service provider has an option of configuring the firewall, but no one bothers to configure it. They don't know where to enable logs, or sometimes they don't bother about enabling logs. And the most, I think something that I find bordering between negligence and misconfiguration is where it has got a world read and open write permission. So they just have a storage where anybody can read and anybody can write anything. And these are the places where anyone in the whole of the world can inject anything they want. They can use it to either spoil your data or inject malware or basically do anything. And this is something that is on the rise in terms of the threats and vulnerabilities, because now for the attackers it's becoming easier to just have more controlled workspaces and more controlled systems, because until the proliferation of the cloud, they had to get hold of user systems and user machines. But with cloud, it's become easy. One, to get a cloud system, it's easy, anybody can get it. And second, to get into an an already provisioned cloud, if you haven't configured it properly, then voila, you just get access to the whole organization that way. Yeah. So now that's again, so if you look at this wheel on the screen, what I've tried to do is I've tried to segregate into the risk domains that we need to consider when we are designing the controls, looking at how we are going to manage the risks around the cloud usage. Now, so this one, I'm not going to go into deep, but this is something that I did for one of my clients a while back, and I just thought it would be useful to share with all of you. But this is just one sample example on how we can actually list down the various controls we currently have or should have across the risk domains, and then see, okay, this is how I'm going to manage the risk on my cloud. Yeah, you might have seen like variations of this as part of your regular study and knowledge research, but this is something I just thought would be helpful to just give an example that this is one way of how you could break down the risk domains and break into specific controls, what you need, what you should have, and what would be a value added type control, because we all have only limited budget across. So if I have to start with something, I'll always look for the foundational ones first and then go with the advanced stuff. Because I think we all agree that we have hundreds and thousands of products in the market, and it is an overwhelming amount of data as to what do we really need versus what is just good to have versus what we don't really need. So this is something that I find useful, and so I thought just sharing. Yeah. Now after this one, considering that this session is more focused on the governance, I will focus on some of the governance aspects. If you see, I've boxed the governance aspects in a red box on the screen. So quickly moving on, I think the first key thing is to have smart policies. Now the reason I call them smart policies, we all have policies, right? And sometimes policies can be deadly because as risk people or as policy defining people, we want to cover all bases in a policy. But my personal take is it should stay high level. It should give enough sufficient guidance to people around what you can and cannot do. So if we talk about just this policy around cloud usage, yeah. And the reason I just focus on public cloud usage is if it's a private cloud hosted in your organization, then I will just treat it as per policy and your own normal IT asset, except for some of the very specific technical aspects of it. But when you go to public cloud, then you need to start specifying on what may and must not go. So what may go is a choice, and what must not go. And I would focus a bit more on what must not go, because this is where people are like, well, I've done X but not Y. Yeah. And something that is very important for, especially for the government and federal entities, is to decide whether we need to look at specific regions or areas where the business units must limit their solutions. So for example, someone may say that, well, I don't want any of my data to be hosted in America because of X reason. Yeah. Or someone might say, I don't want anything, or Singapore says, I don't want my data in China, let's say. So that's something that's an ongoing, but it brings more sensitivity if it's a government or federal entity. Yeah. Then we need to give links to specific standards and guidance, because this is an evolving area for the business. So they also should be guided towards what the standards that they need to follow. And again, something that I tell everyone, that you should have a group of SMEs in your organization who understand cloud from their domain perspective. And these SMEs or their delegates, they should be part of the change board, so that if there's a cloud related change that's been put forward on the change board, it will be a waste of time if it takes too long for people to just think through and look at that. So having your SMEs or as part of the change board or change committee, it brings a lot of value for the end users, and it makes the process fast tracked. Yeah. Okay, now let's say we have got policies. The next question is, what if we are using 2 or more providers? And that's where the complexity begins. How do we ensure that the controls on AWS and the controls on Google and the controls on Azure of the world are consistent? So my way of doing that is we need to have smart cloud standards. And when I say this, I mean something like this. And it doesn't have to follow this tabular format, but I just thought it's easy. For me, if I am an IT developer, I'll find this very helpful. So it tells me exactly what kind of encryption of data at rest expectations are there. If I'm using AWS, then this is what I need to look at. And if you notice, what I have mentioned here is choose from supported instance types. And for encryption on Azure, it requires use of managed disk. So the moment someone reads this, they will know that, I need to look at my disk type for my virtual machine if I'm using Azure. Because where it becomes tricky is that, yes, all these controls and all these nice things are provided by the service providers, but there's always the trick. Now this encryption, SSE, it's not provided on unmanaged disk. So unless you have actually bought a managed disk, you cannot get that encryption. So unless your standard says that it requires use of this, how would an IT developer know? Because someone else is provisioning the VM, and I would believe it's an infrastructure guy. Now the infrastructure guy will not know that I need encryption because it has sensitive data. So he'll just buy whatever is cheaper. And in a lot of cases, that people want to use cloud because it's cheaper. So they will just go with the cheapest unmanaged disk. But when it comes to encryption, they said, well, it doesn't support encryption. Then it just kind of goes back all the way back to square one. And some examples, and again, this is, I've just put as an example that you have to integrate with internal HSM, but you could choose to use the cloud provider's HSM or key management system. Yeah. So the moment you put one control requirement and map it to the various providers that is okay for the organization to use, then it just becomes easier for the end users to follow through. And something that I support is that you don't necessarily always need to create new standards. You could work it with just by improving or enhancing your existing standards. Yeah. And the key bit, other than looking at the IT controls, is having a very, very well-defined master services agreement and a RACI matrix. And RACI stands for responsibility, accountability, consulted, and informed. So basically all the different roles within an operational world. So where possible, we should agree on common security, legal, and regulatory expectations on a master services agreement with the cloud service provider, that this is the minimum baseline I expect from you. Yeah. Especially the roles and responsibilities, and where it's a shared responsibility, that is something, as I said, it needs to have special focus on it. And in terms of the RACI matrix or roles and responsibility, we need to make sure that when we are drawing subcontracts, there are identified individuals or roles who own and understand the various implications related to that subcontract, and also understand the minimum expectations set with the cloud as part of the MSA or Master Services Agreement. And the reason why this is important is the moment you say that Abir is responsible, sorry Abir, I'm taking as an example, but Abir is responsible, or the head of information security is responsible for XYZ to ensuring this, then it just brings in the subconscious kicks in, and it says that, well, now I have to be a bit more serious about this because my name is at stake. And that's just human tendency. So that's about the smart cloud standards. Now the tricky bit is laws and regulations. And I think what I have seen in the organizations is the key challenge is to know which laws and regulations apply to our environment. Now, if the organization is based in one country or in a few, then it's easier to establish. But when it's a multinational, then it gets more muddy. or where we are in a country such as UAE, where we have federal regulations and then we have emirate-based regulations. So it's kind of, it's not always very clear which one to follow and which one to not to follow. Yeah. So if we can do that for this, the only way to do this is to work with the regulators and with your regulatory compliance teams. There's no other way to do that unless we have the knowledge and experience around reading laws and regulations. Yeah. So that's, I'm not going to read the slides, but basically in terms of cloud computing, what I have found useful is if you can train your legal and regulatory people just to explain how cloud computing works, and then they themselves start to relay what legal and regulatory implications might come and what kind of clause will make more sense and keep you protected. So that's where is the, when we look at training for the cloud computing, the most I've seen is people send IT guys for training, people send security guys for training, but not a lot of organizations send their legal and regulatory guys on training on cloud computing. Yeah, so that's something that I think is needs to improve generally. And the other thing is operational monitoring is around SLAs. And SLA is something, again, the minimum baseline should be defined in the master service agreement. But if some of your applications require tighter SLAs, then yes, they should be part of your subcontracts. And then we should also set precedents around what kind of ongoing security checks and compliance assurance checks are we going to do. Are we going to request for, let's say, BAPT on a regular basis, or SOC 2 reports, or events around the privileged access to our environments and stuff like that. So that's something that we need to again define what kind of monitoring we are going to do, who is going to do, what kind of reports are being generated, and if there's something identified, then how are we going to manage that situation. Okay, so that's around the governance. Now, before we head on to the GDPR and cloud, I'll just give everyone a moment to maybe type their questions on the chat window, or just ask the questions. Okay, so if you all can just type in your questions on the window screen, that would be helpful. Okay, so moving on to the GDPR and cloud, I think the first thing to establish every time we talk about GDPR is who is the data controller and who is the data processor. So when we talk about cloud, the cloud service provider is the data processor, and the organization whose data is hosted is the data controller. Now it could be the organization's own data, or it could be the end customer's data. Now, in terms of the key GDPR considerations, we need to look at data ownership. So these 8 things are on the screen are what are the key GDPR considerations. And some of these are kind of common cloud challenges, but when it comes to GDPR, it just brings in slightly more specific and tighter responsibilities from the controller and processor side of things. Now, when we look at data ownership, what GDPR expects is around the cloud usage, we have to spell out on the contract who owns the data and what kind of laws would be applicable. So what are the host countries' laws? Yeah. And we need to specifically highlight that although the cloud service provider is processing our data, we retain the ownership of the transferred data. So legally, that's how we need to take care of that. So in a lot of contracts pre-GDPR, in the pre-GDPR era, the ownership is not something that's very specifically mentioned in the contracts. But in the post-GDPR era, this is something that has to be included in the contract. Yeah. Now, in terms of the visibility of security controls, as I said before, we need to look at how do we get the assurance, or how can we gain visibility on the controls that the service provider has. So we could use a variety of mechanisms, such as we can do our own third-party checks, and something that we can ask for data privacy impact assessment. If the provider has already done, then we need to look at the report and see what it looks like. Or if not, then we need to share our impact assessment checklists. We could look at SOC, SSAE 16, SOC 2 reports, and some standard certifications such as 27001 or 27018, which is basically code of practice for protection of PII in public cloud. So that's 27018. So that's more ISMS in public clouds. So we have a variety of mechanisms to gain visibility of security controls. But it's mostly onto us to think through what is more comfortable on that. Yeah. I'll not go into details around the cloud architecture and portability and stuff, because those I think we need to look at generally also. But the only thing I'll touch upon around data portability is that post GDPR era, what has become important is that we need to clearly specify on the data retrieval mechanisms, because if my end customer is asking me for a data that I have hosted on a cloud, then I should have an agreed mechanism with the cloud provider that yes, it will be provided in a readable format and not just as a junk, so that I can provide it back to my end customer. Again, same for data retention, specifically need to be mentioned in the contract that what kind of retention, how long, how are we going to test. And then what gets tricky is on the GDPR, the right to be forgotten, because that becomes tricky around retention, that yes, I need to retain data for let's say 7 years, but then I need to forget someone. So those things need to be very carefully thought through. Now, something that is often ignored is the metadata. Yeah, because when the way clouds work faster is because they do a lot of clever indexing and store a lot of metadata and stuff like that. So as we define the ownership and responsibility and controls around the normal data and information, we should not forget about the metadata and indexing, because that is usually the forgotten part of the data. Yeah, and we get happy around faster services, but we forget that there's something called indexing and the metadata that can also give access to a certain amount of information. Yeah. And the last but not the least, if God forbid an incident happens, who is going to do what, and how are you going to be able to respond or report an incident within 72 hours to your DPA. So that's I think that again gets tricky, because in most organizations, to get a formal report out in 72 hours, just internal investigations take longer, and this is something we're talking about two different organizations. So this needs to be, one, defined, and two, tested to make sure that yes, the response can come back within the acceptable time, so that you can go back to the regulator within 72 hours. So that brings me to the end of my talk. And so I'll just open the floor to questions then. Yeah, let me see if we have any questions on the screen.
Okay. Yeah, you left a question, and I have one too, but go ahead with it first.
Okay. So key consideration, will data classification go? Yes, so when we talk about data sensitivity, yes, definitely the classification will go under that. And because classification is something that or rather sensitivity is something that determines how you classify the data. So these are kind of quite intertwined, I would say. Yeah. So yes, definitely data sensitivity, data classification, all that I'll put under the same bucket. Now it depends on when you're defining the policy on what is acceptable versus not acceptable. You have to find a clever way of how you define that. Some organizations, they say that, well, you cannot put any highly restricted data, for example, or top secret data onto the cloud. Yeah, so they choose to go just purely by the data classifications, where some organizations like banking, they say that, well, you cannot put I don't know, what mergers and acquisitions type information on the cloud. Some people say that you cannot put the regulatory investigations type data on that. So a lot of, or some people say that you cannot put X application on it. If it is customer accessible or if it impacts something around that, you cannot put those in the cloud. Yeah. And for governments and federals, what I've seen is they say that, well, if we put data around some specific thing, that you cannot put on that. So yes, that is a key consideration on what data, what risk. So you can be smart around what you want to put and what you don't want, and this, it depends on the readiness as well of the organization. If you are pretty comfortable, I would personally start with the lower risk ones, whether I go with the data type or application type, it doesn't matter, but something that I know will not create havoc in my life. So I will start with that. Okay, training our legal and regulators, I would take that as our regulatory compliance guys. Who should perform this training and how deep these trainings should be? Okay, who should perform this training? It's an interesting question. It can be, and again, depends on what kind of internal skills, expertise you have. It can be your IT, or I personally don't want to say information security, but when I say training, it's basically for them to understand how cloud works. Yeah, the basics of cloud computing and how the whole the concept of cloud, as in they move between data centers, the data centers are in different geographies, all that stuff. So that needs to be explained to them. Yeah, because a lot of the legal and regulatory guys, they don't really understand, they don't come from an IT background and they don't need to. So all they need to understand is, yes, this thing called cloud, it will take them to multiple jurisdictions, and it will work like this. So for example, some of the things that I've heard from the legal guys coming after the training has been done is then, okay, but how do we push for a defined law or a defined regulation if we don't know where the data is going? So in the risky situations, what they propose is that you ask for specific data center addresses from the providers, that you, especially for the Europe-based organizations, they say that, well, you can only put my data in, let's say, Ireland and Germany. Yeah, you cannot put it in a US data center. So even so, that's how the designs go from an IT perspective, that they say that, well, you only go to Ireland and Germany. So then the IT operations guys and the service providers, they will architect and design the system accordingly, so that their disaster recovery and everything else, they're just limited to two sites. So who should perform the training? I would think someone from an IT perspective. If you have internal expertise, good. If not, you should get someone to do a basic how cloud works training. Okay, yeah. I hope that answered